Welcome back, everyone. We have several speakers in the next group here that will bring some exciting and useful information to us all. Most of you who have had prior association with US ICOMOS or with historic preservation in America know John Fowler. He was the long-serving executive director of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, a federal agency that has authority under the National Historic Preservation Act to be a bit of a watchdog over the actions of federal agencies as they affect historic preservation of places. John, and then John will be followed by Christophe Rivet, who's executive director of ICOMOS Canada, our sister country organization to the north, and Christophe will talk to us about the comparable situations and the not so comparable ones that exist with our friends in Canada. So John, if you could come on, please.
I'm on. Thank you, Destry. My topic or segment has a somewhat unwieldy title of a presidential executive order for World Heritage Sites and or amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act for a World Heritage section. And based on Destry's remarks on at the last session, I think I'm just going to call it enticement and coercion. What I want to do is look at the legal framework and the opportunities for doing something within our existing legal framework that would enhance the consideration and protection of World Heritage sites primarily in the federal planning process. As Tom Cassidy noted yesterday, the ratification of the World Heritage Convention by the United States did not add any new legal protections to US World Heritage sites. The World Heritage Convention, at least in the United States, is not self-executing. It did not add any specific procedure or legal requirement simply by ratification. And in order to give some meaning to the US commitment to the World Heritage Convention, the Congress would have to enact legislation of a protective nature to carry out the goals of the convention. But that has never happened for US World Heritage sites. Interestingly, in 1980, when the National Historic Preservation Act was amended, the Congress did add a provision for federal agencies operating abroad to take into account the impacts of their actions on World Heritage sites in other nations. But I think at the time, given that all of the US World Heritage sites were national park units, it perhaps was not viewed as needing additional protections in federal law. So since then, the value of World Heritage Site designation in the US has been really to be a tool for advocacy and political suasion, working within the existing legal and planning framework. And Taos is an excellent example of that. The ACHP was involved with that, with the Federal Aviation Administration, and using the World Heritage designation of Taos as a living cultural heritage. The consulting parties were able to get the FAA to take steps that it would never consider doing in restricting overflights. And it felt that the unique status of Taos as a living cultural heritage site was something that it could defend against others saying, well, you did it at Taos, we can do it, you can do it for us someplace else. So it was a useful tool at the time. So basically then, currently US World Heritage sites have no special consideration required in the federal environmental or historic preservation review processes. The good news is, though, that, and this has been interesting listening to the discussions about the heritage impact assessment process and the new UNESCO guidelines on that, is that the current federal laws dealing with environmental reviews and historic preservation reviews are very well developed. And I think they embody the principles and the characteristics that are articulated in the new UNESCO Heritage Impact guidance. The bad news is that as present, these processes make no acknowledgement of World Heritage status as a consideration or a special consideration in the conduct of the processes. So looking at the existing federal legal framework, you have the National Environmental Policy Act that requires federal agencies to consider effects on historic and natural properties as part of their environmental impact statement of projects that they carry out. And the current environmental assessment and EIS procedures, environmental impact statement procedures that are adopted by virtually all federal agencies do not call out World Heritage status or characteristics, the outstanding universal value, as something that needs special consideration in the process. They're completely silent on that factor. Similarly, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider impacts of their actions on properties that are listed on or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Section 106 process, I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I will give you a little bit of an overview of it, because I think its features being a consultative process as opposed to NEPA, which is really a public disclosure process. This is what we're going to do. This is what the impacts are. These are the alternatives. Let us know what you think and we'll make a decision. The Section 106 has evolved into a process that brings together stakeholders and experts with the federal agency, and goes through a negotiation process, essentially, ideally coming out with agreed upon solutions. So Section 106 applies to federal actions, the property management, the things that concern or that are under the agency's direct jurisdiction and control, but also federally assisted projects like, well, federal highways and so on, and so federally funded highways, and federally licensed projects. So something like the Dakota Access Pipeline that requires Corps of Engineer permits falls under Section 106 because of the Corps permits. Federal Communications Commission licenses cell towers. So it's got a very broad scope. The 106 process essentially focuses on adverse effects. There's a very well-developed set of criteria and record of practice when it comes to defining what are adverse effects. And then it requires the agency to engage with preservation experts such as the State Historic Preservation Officer, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, and stakeholders who have an interest in the project and in the historic properties that are affected. Most of the time, these project reviews end up with an agreed upon solution, and only in rare cases do they go to what is ultimately only the advisory power of the ACHP to make comments to the agency, but that's a very rare occurrence. One thing I would mention about the existing Section 106 process, it is particularly strong on opportunities and requirements for federal agencies to consult with Indian tribes, and THPOs. And the ACHP has done a lot of work in setting guidance, and I won't call them standards, but I think it's kind of setting the bar for what is effective tribal communication, and has been working on guidance recently for the consideration of traditional environmental knowledge in the 106 process. But like NEPA, there's no specific mention of World Heritage status or OUV for special consideration. So I think that current federal law has a sound procedural framework, but since it requires no recognition of OUV and sets no higher standard, either procedurally or substantively, for the protection of World Heritage sites, it's essentially, it's a good heritage impact assessment process. It just doesn't have the World Heritage element. So I would mention that I'm talking about, these are government-wide processes that apply to all agencies that undertake actions that affect historic properties or environmental resources. As you've heard and you know, the National Park Service sites have management strategies and plans and requirements as national parks, but they're not protected, as the last panel was very emphatic about, from the actions of other federal agencies. Likewise, non-federally owned historic properties are not, have no elevated status as a World Heritage site in the Section 106 process. So if the Federal Highway Administration wanted to fund a project that was going to dramatically change the roads in front of Taliesin in Wisconsin, the fact that it's a World Heritage site is not something that gives it any additional protection in the site. So the best fix, obviously, would be legislation, but I don't think that's likely to happen in the foreseeable future. As has been noted earlier, there's a long history of concern about blue helmets, or berets, as Destry referred to them, and black helicopters. There's concern for property rights protection, and there's visions of anything that has to do with UNESCO as being an intrusion on US sovereignty. And those concerns have been around for a long time. They are much more, I think, deeply held now, and more vocally held now, where something like these kinds of protections being proposed in legislation. So assuming that it's highly unlikely that the Congress would impose procedural requirements, what can be done? Well, there's precedent for the executive branch taking action. In the Obama administration, the ACHP, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the Department of the Interior sat down to create a handbook for incorporating World Heritage concepts into the existing Section 106 and NEPA processes. It was fairly well developed, but it didn't come to fruition. I think some folks at CEQ got cold feet. But what was developed is, I think, provides some guidance for what might be done in the current administration. As we've seen, the Biden administration is not at all shy about taking executive action to achieve policy goals that can't be achieved through legislation. With the potential change in the control of Congress, executive action may become even more likely in the remainder of the presidency. So, looking at administrative actions, the most effective means to protect World Heritage sites would be an executive order issued by the president. Executive orders are presidential directives that govern the operations of federal agencies. The agencies are bound to follow them. So the US treaty obligation under the World Heritage Convention provides certainly a policy basis. And if you look at the Section 106 and NEPA provide the legal basis. Wayne, I can't read your thing in the chat, so I'll have to look at that later. You want me to explain something?
You're out
Okay.
of time anyway, John.
Huh?
You're out of time anyway.
I'm out of time. You don't want me to say what I thought ought to go into an EO?
Go right ahead.
All right, I'll be quick. I thought I was gonna be way short on time. Okay, so what an EO could do, it could direct agencies to identify potential project impacts on the outstanding universal World Heritage sites. Could also go to things that are not articulated in the OUV statements, such as Native American cultural prospects. It could require agencies to look at effects on view sheds and buffer zones. It could possibly include proactive reports to the World Heritage Center per the World Heritage Operational Guidelines, which was done for UVA and Statue of Liberty. Could require agencies to consider to avoid harm in consultation with expert agencies, Interior, the Park Service, CEQ, NOAA, the ACHP. Could set a 4F standard. I won't go too far into that, but that's where DOT agencies have to determine there's no feasible and prudent alternative to a particular action. And it could also extend agency responsibilities to consider properties on the US tentative list. So, and my final note on that is what happens if you go through a process and there's still an impact. One could look at the God Squad model of the Endangered Species Act, where you have a committee of expert agencies like, again, Interior, CEQ, NOAA, determine the final outcome, which would be binding on the agency. Or you could use the CEQ NEPA referral model, where unresolved cases are reviewed by CEQ and can be referred to the president for final action. And then finally, you could have the EO could deal with federal property management, bring Park Service level management standards to other property management agencies that have World Heritage sites, like BLM, require, and this picks up on the discussion from the last session, require federal property management agencies to be good neighbors to World Heritage sites, such as the federal consistency concept. So anyway, and there you go.
Very good, John. Thank you.
I'm through.
All right. We'll get you some questions in a little bit, but Christophe, please take it away. You've got your full amount of time.
Oh, I'm good. Actually, this is a conversation that we're having, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to attend US ICOMOS General Assembly Symposium. Last time I attended one was in person. Can you imagine that? That was just before the pandemic. I'll clarify also, Destry, that I'm the president of ICOMOS Canada. And where it's important is that since the executive director does all the work, I don't want to steal the spotlight. So Stéphane Tresseau, our executive director, is our executive director. So I've been asked to talk about, give a snapshot about the kind of threats that we're facing with our World Heritage sites here in Canada. And basically what I'll do is give everyone a primer of what it means to manage World Heritage sites here. And then I'll introduce some basic what I believe are the basic elements of change coming up. And I'd like to address this less as a threat than the change, because what we might perceive as a threat is generally a reaction to what we know, and what might be coming, and the way that we're going to adapt to it might turn out to be even better than what we do. But that being said, I think we need to be critical about what's coming. So in terms of World Heritage Sites in Canada. First off, it's important to appreciate that Canada is a confederation. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. These territories fall under federal legislation and regulation. So they are distinct political entities, but not quite with the same powers as provinces. When it comes to culture and heritage, that jurisdiction is provincial. When we talk about submitting nominations for World Heritage inscriptions of cultural sites, the provinces are involved and heavily involved. It's their legislation that protects things. At the federal level, the federal authority, which is held by the Parks Canada agency, has authority to protect heritage only on federal lands and only on the ones that are owned and administered by Parks Canada, because it is the act that governs that agency that in fact gives it power to protect heritage. We are currently debating in Parliament a proposed legislation that would protect National Historic Sites. And in that legislation, there is a direct reference to World Heritage Sites. So this is the only tool to date in Canada, provincial or federal, that makes direct mention of World Heritage responsibilities. So we'll see how that legislation continues its way through the parliamentary process. But it is noteworthy that this is the first piece of federal legislation that would protect National Historic Sites. We don't have that here. And it is also the first piece of legislation that directly mentions Canada's responsibilities towards World Heritage. So in terms of our World Heritage Sites, we currently have 20 sites inscribed. We have, and of those 29 are cultural and 1 is mixed. I'll just name them and give you a quick mental image of what they are. The first one that was inscribed, which is also one of the first ones ever, one of the first World Heritage Sites ever inscribed, is L'Anse aux Meadows National Historic Site, which was inscribed in 1978. And that is an archaeological site that is a Viking site in northern Newfoundland. So Newfoundland being the province furthest east of our coast. And then we have other iconic places like Head Smashed and Buffalo Jump, perhaps less well known, but it is one of the most complete sites related to the plains cultures. So it's a buffalo jump, and that site is located in Alberta, which is the province, one of the provinces in central, in the prairies of Canada. The Historic District of Old Quebec. So this is located in the eastern province of Quebec. It is the crucible, the cradle rather, of French culture in the Americas. So it's the entire set of fortifications from the French period with core elements of the old French settlement. So that dates back to the 17th and 18th century. Then we have Old Town Lunenburg, which is a fishing community on the east coast of Canada in Nova Scotia. It's evidence of British traditional colonial settlements from the 17th century. So it's really a historic town, a historic wooden town, largely. And then Skangwai, which is an indigenous site on the west coast, on the islands off the coast of British Columbia. And it is a traditional indigenous site, largely famous for its mortuary poles. Then we have the Landscape of Grand Pré, which is a site I worked on myself as project manager. It's a site located, again, in Nova Scotia on the Bay of Fundy, so the highest tides in the world. And this is an agricultural landscape that is protected by dikes. And lastly, we have Writing on Stone Isinaipi, which is the largest concentration of petroglyphs in the country. And it's located, again, in Alberta, in southern Alberta. And in terms of the mixed site, our site is called Pimachonaki, and it's a large site that overlaps, that saddles the border of 2 provinces, Ontario and Manitoba, so in the center of Canada. It's a site that has significant ecosystemic values, but also is illustrative of the way of life of the Anishinaabe people. So there are some elements that are tied to archaeology, others are petroglyph, rather pictographs, and others are spiritual, other aspects are spiritual. So it gives you a flavor of the type of sites that that we have. And so when we think of the pressures that these sites will face, we have to think about the effects of climate change primarily. And we have to consider that most of these sites are administered by agencies, by government agencies. So these government agencies are already equipped with tools to manage these places as historic sites. So you can expect the gamut of traditional tools for legislative tools to protect the site from potential impacts or from development, but also the type of tools that lead to proper management. So having resources and so on and so forth. So this is a really fairly traditional type of profile. And the main threats to those sites at this point are climate change related. So some of these sites are on coastal areas, so you can expect significant impacts from rising sea levels. And this site that I mentioned earlier that's protected by dikes, there's a real pressure to maintain those dikes in order to maintain the site itself. But I'll jump to our tentative list sites, because I think this is where the particularly impactful change occurs. So these sites are, for the most part, Indigenous. So I'm just going to name a couple: Tronje Klondike, which is located in the Yukon. We have Katurnapak in northern Canada. Hayartarik, which is an Inuit site of petroglyphs. So why it's noteworthy is because not only will those sites have to deal with the effects of climate change, but they are being proposed as sites that are not clearly protected by legislation in place. So these are not national historic sites or provincial sites or even national parks as we understand them. These are sites that will develop their own governance, that will develop their own protective mechanisms. And that's the biggest challenge. It's the biggest challenge, but it's also the type of change that reflects how the World Heritage Convention is looking at the future. So the operational guidelines are putting more emphasis on sustainability. They're putting more emphasis on engaging communities. And this is what Canada's tentative list is offering. It's offering huge challenges because we don't know fully how we're going to deal with these questions of protection and management and relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown. But it's also allowing us to think about how we would lead the way in meeting those aspirations of the convention. So how do we engage people? How do we empower Indigenous communities to co-manage or even to fully manage sites that are significant to their cultural context? So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Very good, Christophe. I see, Christophe, that Christine sends greetings from your work together at World War I ABMC sites. You get around, as does she, I might add. So you have explained, Christophe, quite a different legal structure for your sites, split in some ways, although we have some state parks and some national parks and some private sites as well. But it's interesting. And your final comment there gives, it's definitely challenging. I think if we pursue the serial nomination of civil rights movement sites, we may run into some of that in the necessity for how we plan as well. John, Tom Cassidy talked yesterday about World Heritage in Danger as a mechanism to identify threats, but it has no sort of action forcing element to it other than jawboning and politicking. Your executive order idea would go further. It seems to me like, in more of a preventive mode, because agencies would proactively consider, as they consider alternatives, they would have to look, at an alternative that doesn't adversely affect the World Heritage OUVs. So, do you see that distinction? Am I reading it right? Not being a lawyer.
Well, I mean, the whole basis for NEPA and Section 106 is to integrate considerations of environmental and preservation impacts at the earliest stages of planning, and that's when you can come up, most readily with solutions. And both processes require the consideration of alternatives. It seems to me that the World Heritage in Danger listing would be where all those processes failed. And if we had a planning system that was involved, or that involved the thorough consideration of OUV at the outset, and then also had some higher procedural requirements, i.e., for example, in the Section 106 process, the National Historic Landmarks are called out in the NHPA for more consideration than standard National Register properties. That got embodied in the ACHP's regulations of requiring that the ACHP be involved in consultation, which it's usually not, and that the Secretary of Interior, as the steward for National Historic Landmarks, be also invited to participate in the consultation. So if you had adverse effects that were impacting the OUV of a World Heritage Site, then you could set up a process that brought in additional experts, raised the level of the consultation so that the likelihood of coming up with a solution that wasn't driven by the regional BLM office would be maybe more likely to happen.
Yeah, good. Hey, Christophe, I know that your three tentative list sites all have First Peoples involvement, but I think you have engaged First Peoples in a number of World Heritage sites. I know in yesterday's program, the superintendent at Glacier Bay talked about the Native involvement there, the Hoona people on the West Coast, but I think in the Tatshenshini, Alsek, Kluane region on your side of the border, there's also First Peoples involvement. Just any comments? How's that going?
Well, I think, so a few years back, we had a national investigation into the relationships with First Nations and to what First Nations have, well, Indigenous people, not just First Nations, so Inuit and the Métis, what they've experienced in terms of the impacts of colonial activities. And the result of that investigation was a report called the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And that specific report identified recommendations that provide guidance to society at large, but more specifically government agencies, on how to achieve that reconciliation, which effectively means recognizing the impact of our policies, the detrimental impacts of our policies on Indigenous people, and ways to address that. Addressing it by recognizing their rights, their fundamental rights on the land, the rights to govern themselves in terms of some of the treaties that were negotiated many centuries ago. So it's really introduced a shifting of mindset for society as a whole that has led to more direct involvement of First Nations in co-management initiatives, more direct involvement in designing management approaches, It positions First Nations in an equal standing when it comes to determining the future of the land and the waters that are associated with their traditional territories. So that shift continues to be a work in progress. I mean, it's a major cultural transformation for agencies and the Canadian society, but it's now deeply embedded in the way that we approach questions of policies, from the municipal level, from the organizational level, from the highest level of government. There is never a missed opportunity to pause and wonder, how do we engage Indigenous people? How do we respectfully address their needs and have them guide us towards what needs to be done? I'm hoping I'm not depicting a rosy picture, but I do want to stress the amount of effort that is ongoing to change the mindset and really look at things quite differently.
Well, I would say even though it's not rosy necessarily, you're ahead of us. You may have heard Mike Reynolds talking earlier about the director's initiative at Coast Stewardship. I think we're going to move in that direction, and we're able to learn from your experience. I suspect that the superintendent at Glacier Bay and also at Wrangell St. Elias are in touch with your managers and your First Peoples involvement there, since it is one big complex. And that's probably helpful and informative as we look at this in other places. So that's a very good thing.
Sorry, I was just going to say, fundamentally, the question that is at the heart of all this is the idea of authority. Who has authority? And we're in the business of value, us heritage folks. So when we ask ourselves who has authority, we have to stretch our minds to connect to this idea of value. So who has authority to define that value? Who has authority to define the threats to that value? Who has authority to make the decisions for the well-being of whatever we care about? And what we're seeing is as a departure from defining authority strictly as what is stated in law and what empowers a government official to achieve, to introducing moral authority, spiritual authority, and cultural authority as being as important in achieving the goal of preserving heritage.
Very good.
And I would note that that's one thing that has been developed in the Section 106 process is a deferral to Indigenous people in defining what the significant values are, how do you deal with them, what's an appropriate solution in the end. And that's a continuing process, and it's fortunate we're operating in the current administration.
So John, hearkening back to your ACHP days, were there any examples when you're going through the 106 process with agencies or culturally affiliated tribes where the fact of a World Heritage Site engaging or attempting to engage as a consulting party came into play?
Well, the Taos Airport case is the poster child for that.
Yeah.
And there you had the Pueblo leadership, actively engaged and articulating the values that they were trying to protect. And it's an interesting case because you were dealing with what you might almost call psychological impacts. You were talking about not simply noise levels of aircraft overflight that could disturb group or personal, individual religious and cultural practices. The issue of seeing an aircraft in the airspace, when you're on a vision quest in the forest, was something that was a factor that was considered in how do you mitigate or minimize the harm from the project. And I guess that was the positive poster child for engagement of World Heritage site manager isn't quite the term for it. I think the flip side is if you don't have the World Heritage Site manager at the table and being an advocate for protecting those values that are inherent in the World Heritage designation, who's going to do it? And you really do need to have that voice in this consultative process.
Right. Well, I think in the interest of keeping on schedule, gentlemen, thank you very much. This was greatly appreciated and lots of food for thought and to contemplate actions that we should be taking to match yours and your experience, John. Thank you very much. Up next, I believe we have a short video from Lazare Assomo, the brand new head of the World Heritage Center.
Mr. Lazare Eloundou Assomo is the director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center. 6 weeks after he took that post, Ukraine was invaded by the Russian Federation. Because the World Heritage Committee had been scheduled to meet in 2022 in the Russian Federation, and because the current chair of the committee is from the Russian Federation, the meeting had to be postponed. Since then, Mr. Assomo has been working around the clock to deal with this unexpected turn of events. He has kindly provided us access to an interview conducted by Catherine Cameron of him, along with former World Heritage Center Director McDell Rossler. What follows are Mr. Assomo's comments from that interview on the future of the World Heritage Convention and the challenges it faces today. With that, I present Mr. Lazare Eloundou Assomo.
It's probably manageable in terms of archiving a list, but in terms of managing, the issues that are facing the protection, conservation, and promotion of the World Heritage sites, and the role that this World Heritage sites play for helping to contribute to resolving some of the most important issues that our world is facing. I think it's time to look at it, and the one of the things will be to now open the discussion on these challenges and to see with all the state parties if really this list can continue like that, just like inscribing sites, because the risk is that instead of being a World Heritage list, it's going to be an inventory. It's not enough because the list has grown. And now, since many countries have ratified the convention and that the needs will be growing and growing, this is where we're going to have a problem, because we'll have less to give for all the sites in future. And this is the challenge. And this is where we now need to think about new avenues, how to create new cooperation or to try to see if maybe the private sectors or voluntary contribution can come in even more and more, because the challenges are growing and the demands is also growing in future. But I will say that although we have been able to support some of the sites, particularly from least developed countries, I think in future we will need more funding, not only to support them, but also to support the World Heritage Center as the main secretariat who is coordinating this work. I think what state parties are expecting for the moment, it's a policy. And up to date, we do not have a policy which has been adopted and accepted by everyone on how we can try to fight, or reduce the impact of climate change to natural and cultural sites. And the moment we are going to have this policy, and I think we'll start discussing how to implement the policy and what will be the relation with the understanding the threat to the outstanding universal value, on how to support activities or to undertake conservation activities or other decisions to be taken. We need to guide state parties on how to deal with issues. Because UNESCO understood very quickly that there was now a new tactic of war where some groups will use the fact that they are destroying cultural heritage to control some of the communities by depriving them from their cultural identities, their cultural references, and depriving them from what constitute the main part of their social fabric, if I can say, because then they will lose any reference, and it will be easy for those extremist groups to use them as human bombs. And so it was a security imperative. And that's the reason why it was important for UNESCO to alert the international community and bring them. And I think we saw it in Timbuktu, because the reason why the mausoleums in Timbuktu were destroyed by the extremist groups was exactly for this reason. And it was important because the religious buildings that were, these mausoleums were religious buildings also for them, and cultural building, became really a big problem for the security for the region and everything. And it was important that the Security Council, send an alarm and, at least act through some of the decisions that were taken there, and also that UNESCO cooperates with the International Criminal Court, and to bring, some of the perpetrators of this destruction to justice. Definitely not, because it will add on top of everything. Simply because today, when there is a destruction anywhere in the world, communities, governments are looking at UNESCO. And they expect UNESCO to do something. And this is what we see, for example, today with the current situation of the war in Ukraine, where cultural heritage is being destroyed. And of course, UNESCO has to act, because UNESCO is expected to protect, cultural heritage, of all its member states and everywhere. And I think one thing that has been positive through the experience of Mali is that there's no impunity. I can say that there's no impunity when there is intentional destructions, and that the perpetrators of this kind of act can be taken to justice. And I think this has been a very important shift in the way we are looking at the destruction of cultural heritage and world heritage. And now we have this experience. So I think in terms of our approach and producing some of the tools and strategies, UNESCO has today the experience to act quickly, alert the world, or take some actions or emergency actions to help protect, these sites that are facing destruction in the event of armed conflicts. I went back and started reading again the convention. And I realized that, there's one part on who are the partners. And I think when you look at this part, I mean, partners are not only governments, partners are all the stakeholders that they have not only an interest in using the site, but also in protecting it. And of course, today, it is definitely important to involve civil society. And maybe, when the convention, and Mexican can talk about it and yourself, when the convention started to be implemented, this issue was not probably raised as it is today. Now there are sometimes we see issues of human rights, and that's the reason why even the World Heritage Committee, in trying to examine some of the nomination files, is also trying to address this issue. But I consider that this is not enough, and I think the World Heritage, we have to do more because the human rights issues, the cultural rights issues are absolutely important. We were talking about, the Agenda 2030 and sustainable development. All these issues are very important. Protecting indigenous people, protecting local communities, and protecting their rights to use the sites. It's very important. And we are seeing more and more complaints. And I think it's important to give more role, and that's my belief, to give more role to the civil society during the World Heritage Committee, in order to listen to them, to listen to the issues that they would like to raise. The World Heritage Convention and system is universal now. And I think this is an important success. Everywhere you go, and when you hear World Heritage, it speaks to you. And I think, and that's also the reason why when people refer to UNESCO, the first thing that comes to their mind is the beautiful sites that are recognized in the world. And this is something which is important. And I think it was made possible because it's one of the international instrument which has the mechanisms that works perfectly. And the second important achievement I think of is that the World Heritage are also part of development strategies of many countries. When they think about World Heritage, then think about inscribing World Heritage, there is also some of the investment and many things that people now start slowly putting in place because they have World Heritage, because it's going to attract the international travelers, because it's going to promote their culture. And so this is something which you don't see with, not enough with other cultural conventions, but you see it with World Heritage. And if you ask me what's going to happen in future, my easy answer that I don't know. But what I start seeing is the digital transformation, the digital era. I think we are now moving slowly to this. People are using smartphones, are sending pictures. They would like to visit World Heritage sites, through their computers. They would like to know more. They would like to better understand. And I think we will slowly have to also deal with this issue of, the digital era in future. And the other thing which we were mentioning is all the other connection to World Heritage sites that are important. That is how to use World Heritage sites to deal with some of the global challenges of the world. Climate change being one of them. We saw the pandemic, which is also, how we also deal with this kind of issue in future. And the whole issue of human rights, which will come more and more because of all issues that are being dealt, around World Heritage sites. Mechtil probably didn't speak about one thing which has also been one of her challenges, which I think is going to be mine, is how to deal with the issue of politicization. And I think because I think since diplomats, politicians, governments, and other interests are now coming more and more, we have to deal with it. We have to deal with geopolitics. We can see today with the whole issue of the war in Ukraine and what it creates, because they are still discussing where and how to organize the next World Heritage Committee, which has nothing to do with the technical work and the responsibility of the center, but we have to deal with it. And we might see this more and more as a big challenges. And for me, I started my tenure, I think six weeks after I started working. I had to face the consequence of the war in Ukraine and all the other consequences, and I'm still dealing with it. So it shows me already some of the issues in future. One other thing which is going to be for us a big challenge is, of course, the resources, because this is not going to I think is going to be a bigger challenge again, because you have to deal with things every day. And at the World Heritage Center, we need to continue to rely on the professionals who are working here. And the staff of the World Heritage Center, it's absolutely important. There are great professionals here, and without them, it's very, very difficult. And I will even say it will be impossible to meet all the challenges. Then the last one is that we are dealing today with more urgent demands. Every day there is something new. There's something to deal with. There is a solution to bring, to find, because we have 194 state parties, so they are asking and they expect the World Heritage Center to provide them with all the information to analyze their project, to receive the answers. They want to continue with the nominations, so they want to make sure that they are in the right side. And we have to provide all this information. We have to coordinate this. And it means that the center will also have to adapt to this new environment with this complexity.
Well, with that profound statement, much to contemplate for the future. We move into our next group of speakers. They will each speak individually, and then we'll gather collectively for discussion and questions, beginning with Steve Morris. Everybody knows Stephen, I think. He is the manager of the National Park Service Office of International Affairs. Then we'll move into Christine Jacobs, the superintendent of San Antonio Missions, World Heritage Site, and then to Dr. Gary Machlis, Clemson University Professor of Environmental Sustainability and former Chief Science Advisor to the Director of the Park Service. Steve, take it away.
Well, thank you, Destry, and let me say it's a pleasure to be here. It's been a long day, but very interesting. Lots of thoughtful presentations, and I know we're coming to the end, so I will try to be snappy and quick. I think my session is entitled, how can public or soft diplomacy support World Heritage actions in foreign countries? And I guess I want to begin by just asking if that's the right frame. I think that what that statement really means is, how can we get the State Department to help us carry out our World Heritage responsibilities in other countries? And if you look at what the definition of soft diplomacy or public diplomacy is, essentially communicating directly with foreign publics to get the foreign public support for our government's strategic objectives. And some might question whether that's really in keeping with the premise or the obligations that we have as a signatory to the World Heritage Convention. We are pledged by being signatories to help other countries with their World Heritage sites. It's supposed to be as I think Mike Reynolds said earlier today, a network of countries that cooperate with each other to help preserve this patrimony. However, being realistic, I think we have to say we do need to get support from other sources if we're ever going to be able to carry out those obligations. And so we can't always be purists. So what I'd like to do now is give you an overview of the role that my office plays in terms of working with other countries on, to support World Heritage, as well as other kinds of work that we do that aren't directly connected to World Heritage. So if we could have, and before we go to the next slide, I'll just mention there are a number of other government agencies that have active programs, including the State Department. They have the Cultural Heritage Center, which does a lot of work in other countries, and the U.S. Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, which is well funded and has done some terrific work, including at World Heritage Sites. We have the Fish and Wildlife Service, which has a very active international program. So there are many U.S. government agencies that are doing good work overseas that in some ways is supporting World Heritage, although it's not always targeted specifically towards World Heritage. It's almost by coincidence that they're helping World Heritage Sites. But having said that, if we can go to the next slide, and I can start with the overview of what we do in the Park Service's international program. I wanted to begin by just mentioning that we have specific authority and direction from Congress through the National Historic Preservation Act to do this kind of work. The NHPA specifically asks the Secretary to make available to other nations and international organizations pursuant to the World Heritage Convention training in and information concerning methods and techniques for the preservation of historic properties. So there it is in black and white from Congress. We need to be doing this. The regulations are the kicker, as you see down below here. It says, to the extent that resources permit, the department will encourage and provide international assistance. So that small phrase, to the extent that resources permit, is a key one. It's been one of the reasons why we haven't been able to do as much as we would like. Next slide, please. So I think this next slide, I'm going to talk about the World Heritage, U.S. World Heritage Fellowship, which in my mind is one of the best efforts that we made in the Park Service to sort of fulfill our responsibilities under the convention, which was to host staff and managers from foreign countries directly at U.S. World Heritage sites for 2 to 3 week residencies where they were interacting directly with their peers who were managers of our World Heritage sites. This program went from 2010 to 2013, 3 years. It was funded initially by the UN Foundation, and then we had some other partners that came in later. All in all, there were 13 fellows that served in 12 national parks. Can we go to the next slide, please? And here are the list of the fellows, including the countries and the sites that they came from and where they were placed in the US. As you can see, they were all from developing nations, Brazil, Kenya, South Africa, Peru, Zambia, Philippines, and so on. And we placed them in parks around US national parks that are World Heritage sites around the country, from Hawaii volcanoes to Everglades to Grand Canyon and Mesa Verde and others. So it was a very good program, and we were very sorry when the funding finally ran out and we had to sort of put it on pause. I think the point I'd like to make is that we can certainly bring this program back with the resources, and essentially it was purchasing airline tickets and hosting these people when they were here in the US. So it was not an expensive program, but nonetheless, we don't have the funding to continue it today. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we work with other countries is to host delegations that come to the US and meet with them. We help arrange study visits to parks. They often come to the Washington headquarters office and meet with our leadership. And then they go to various units of the National Park System, including World Heritage sites. And depending on their interests, we craft a specific itinerary and specific subject matter experts for them to interact with while they're here. of course, we also, when we have funding, usually from outside donors, USAID or the State Department, we can send our people overseas to also interact with their colleagues and provide the same kind of shared learning. And I should emphasize that although we bring expertise and we have a lot of it, we also, of course, learn a lot from these other countries. Next slide, please. Since the pandemic began, we discovered how much we could accomplish online, and we've been hosting quite a few technical webinars and online sessions with a variety of foreign countries. It's really been fascinating. Some of these include multiple countries, others are specifically targeted to individual countries, and it can vary. The topics are very wide-ranging, from accessibility in national parks to invasive species control, to interpretation and education, to climate vulnerability assessments. So it's just amazing. And again, it allows us to cast a very wide net, since everybody these days has a computer connection. And we typically, the format is we will present from our side and we'll have a counterpart from another country present, and then there's this back and forth dialogue. Next slide, please. We have the Sister Park program, which has already been mentioned several times over the past couple of days. This is, of course, where we're twinning US national parks with parks in other parts of the world. We have a number, more than 36 of these relationships, and they're an effective way for there to be peer-to-peer interaction and exchanges on whatever issues are most relevant for the individual parks involved. We don't direct from on high what the focus of the partnerships are going to be. We leave that totally up to the individual park directors and their staffs. Next slide, please. A good example of the Sister Park partnerships is the Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska, paired with West Norwegian fjords. Both of them are World Heritage Sites. And as I mentioned in the Managers Forum on the first day, this partnership got started through the Marine Managers Network, the World Heritage Center's Marine Managers Network, which has meets every 4 years or so in person, and has been a terrific way to share expertise. And it led, in this case, to a very substantial and ongoing, more than 10-year partnership between these two World Heritage Sites. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to mention our International Volunteer in Parks program. This is a little bit like the World Heritage Fellowship, where we host international foreign nationals. They can be students or they can be staff or professionals from other countries who will do internships, training. That's a training opportunity in our national parks, not just our World Heritage National Parks, but all over the country, all 400 plus units. We have authority, or we're certified, I should say, by the State Department to be the sponsor for their exchange visas that they get when they come over. And we develop a training plan with the park. Our office helps place them in the parks, and they have to provide their own funding to travel to the US, but in many cases, once they're here, US parks can help provide them low cost or free housing. And of course, they're getting really valuable experience working in some of our most spectacular places. So again, this is just a menu of different ways that we can, sort of honor our obligations in terms of World Heritage and working with other countries. And we need additional resources, I would say, to really be able to expand this. But I certainly think there's a lot of opportunities in the future to do a lot more of this kind of thing. And I think there's one more slide. We have a small office. This is our office on a recent outing with one of our international volunteers from Chile, who was hosted at the C&O Canal right here in the Washington, D.C. area. But we work with all the parks around the country. And so we leverage their efforts to try to, respond to the international mission of the National Park Service. And that's our webpage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Christine?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Steve, I mean, sorry.
I'll wait just a second for Ariana to pull up the slide deck. My name is Christine Jacobs. I am the superintendent of San Antonio Missions National Historical Park and San Antonio Missions World Heritage Site. And next slide, please. Although the title of this session is Expanding International Exchange Program and Other Training Opportunities Internationally, I've sort of reframed it for what makes the most sense to me, which is really cultivating future generations of World Heritage Site managers. And that's not just in the United States. I really appreciated that Stephen mentioned soft diplomacy. Some of the photos on this particular slide illustrate where my perspective is coming from. I worked and was happy to hear references to the Taos Pueblo Airport Expansion EIS. That was an effort I was involved in many, many years ago. And then more recently, before coming to San Antonio, I worked for the American Battle Monuments Commission headquarters in Paris, France, where I had the opportunity to work with ABMC sites around the world. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see a photo of North Africa American Cemetery, which is entirely within the boundaries of Carthage World Heritage Site. To the right and working clockwise, there's a photo of me and my great colleague and friend, Teresa Pascal from the Pueblo of Acoma, along by the Eiffel Tower, along Paris banks of the Seine, World Heritage Site. And then moving clockwise, I had the opportunity here in San Antonio to welcome the ambassador from France to the United States for a site visit to San Antonio Missions World Heritage Site. And in the bottom of this slide, you see Cristobal Lopez, who was an intern with us through the Latino Heritage Internship Program, and his work here at San Antonio Missions has been absolutely invaluable. Next slide, please. One of the efforts I have been really pleased to participate in since I've been here in San Antonio in particular is the International Exchange Program that US ICOMOS offers. Next slide, please. One of the reasons I think this has been particularly valuable is because it's given us an opportunity to engage with subject matter experts as interns from other countries. In this case, this year we had Séverine Collard from Belgium in the field. And so the commitment to hosting an IEP, in terms of soft diplomacy and cultivating that next generation of World Heritage specific site managers and stewards, I think cannot be overstated. And the commitment by current US World Heritage Site managers to serve as mentors and leaders and facilitate those connections is really remarkable. Next slide, please. Pivoting to another program that was mentioned earlier today, in collaboration with the National Park Foundation, in collaboration with Mission Heritage Partners and American Youth Works and the Texas Conservation Corps, here at San Antonio Missions, we're in the second year of our Cultural Landscape Apprentice Program. Next slide, please. This particular program has highlighted Latino youth in the San Antonio community and provided them with an opportunity not only to work at San Antonio Missions National Historical Park, but to frame cultural landscape and heritage management in a World Heritage Site. So this is an opportunity. It also provides a non-competitive hiring authority through the Public Land Corps. We can talk about that potentially later in the future, but it's an opportunity to introduce, on the ground, both kind of the academic framework of cultural landscape management, World Heritage Site management, but really the nuts and bolts on the ground of how we manage a US World Heritage Site. Next slide, please. Similarly, as was mentioned earlier today, we've had a fantastic partnership dating back to 2008 here at San Antonio Missions that underscores, I think, our continued commitment to traditional trades. Our Preservation Masonry Apprentice Program is something that we've partnered with, again, American Youth Works, the Environmental Corps, and Mission Heritage Partners. Next slide, please. To provide youth with an opportunity to learn firsthand about preservation maintenance on the largest collection of Spanish colonial structures in the United States here in San Antonio, under the umbrella of the World Heritage Site and alongside many of our partners as well. Next slide, please. also want to highlight, just the myriad of opportunities that we have as U.S. World Heritage Site managers, not just National Park Service sites as well, to work through whether it's the Latino Heritage Internship Program or the Mosaics in Science program, to introduce and welcome our next generation of leaders, regardless of what subject matter area they're working in, whether it's geology, whether it's history, whether it's hydrology, into the fold of U.S. World Heritage Site management, not only as a collaborative opportunity, but to kind of expand on some of the efforts that Stephen was talking about, these cross-cultural exchanges, and really inspiring, we hope, again, the next generation of our site managers. Next slide, please. I am particularly passionate about collaborating with Youth Crew. American Youth Works and the Texas Conservation Corps here for us in San Antonio have provided us with an opportunity to reach an incredibly diverse cohort of young people who are already interested in public service, in world heritage, in resource management, both cultural and natural. The extensive training, the investment that San Antonio Missions National Historical Park and the whole World Heritage Site, the crews you see in the photos on these pages work alongside the teams at the San Antonio River Authority, the city and the county, not just with the National Park Service. So their work really, really is taking place under the umbrella of the World Heritage Site, which we emphasize from the minute they walk in the door to the minute they leave, that their resume should include not only work at a National Park Service unit, but also specifically within the context of the U.S. World Heritage Site. Next slide, please. From my perspective, is we really talk about expanding our education, exchange programs and trainings and outreach. Our biggest sort of bang for our buck as far as investment is really in education and outreach. I have a quote from one of our current National Park Service rangers, World Heritage Site rangers here in San Antonio, just to illustrate that our commitment to educating, whether it's co-teaching classes with the Conservation Society at UTSA in historic architecture or World Heritage Site management, those are partnerships we have underway, to Junior Ranger Day, developing our own unique badges and branding to go along with that, and really also partnering too. In the lower left-hand corner, we have a fantastic partnership here in San Antonio with the San Antonio Food Bank, where we actually lease historic agricultural lands that would have supported the missions at the time to the San Antonio Food Bank, where they are growing food to serve the community of San Antonio. There are volunteers cultivating those fields, and we have a demonstration farm where there's an area where the traditional agricultural practices of irrigation using the acequias, these are the same acequias that are called out in the U.S. World Heritage Site nomination, the inscription for San Antonio Missions, are still working today. So that's us using the 13.5 miles of Spanish colonial irrigation ditches for the original designed intended purpose as part of our maintenance strategy for these internationally significant features. Next slide, please. And similarly, we've talked a lot in the last couple of days about the importance of working with tribes, of working with indigenous communities, and of working with other traditionally associated communities for whom U.S. World Heritage Sites were, are, and will continue to be home, places of cultural continuity, and that sense of place and connectedness that someone perhaps from another side of the world who comes to even a U.S. World Heritage Site couldn't potentially understand or experience. And so really looking at how can we take this kind of connection and Christophe's discussion about working with communities in Canada, I think is really, really relevant and important, in particular in the context of all U.S. World Heritage Site management and the discussion that Destry was bringing forward with previously inscribed sites that were inscribed for, natural purposes, potentially, really going back and looking at what are the cultural significance of those sites that maybe at the time of inscription, it's not as though they weren't there, they just weren't called out potentially or recognized. And so really collaborating with community members to bring some of that forward. On this particular slide in the upper left-hand corner, you can see we had a ribbon cutting of a mission descendant exhibit 1 year ago this month at the San Antonio airport. It was an opportunity for us in response to feedback from the mission descendant community, which is a very culturally complex community here in San Antonio, a mix of indigenous community members, Canary Islanders, indigenous Mexican community members, were not feeling as though their faces were connected to the missions. And so now millions of visitors who fly into San Antonio see those faces first at the airport, the people for whom the sites are important. It is working with community members to continue cultural practices in and around the missions, everything from History and Genealogy Day to Dia de los Muertos. Next and last slide, please. So in closing and before I turn it over to Dr. Gary Machlis, to me, this slide kind of embodies of what the future of US, really an international world site management looks like. It looks just, it looks more equitable, it looks more diverse, it looks more inclusive, and it looks more proactive, where the United States World Heritage Site managers were contributors and leaders within the global heritage community, including within the United States. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Gary, take it over. And when you're done, we'll have a short chat with Steve and Christine and yourself.
Sounds good. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you on the future of science in support of World Heritage Sites. I'll be brief as the closing is close. What do we mean by science that can support World Heritage Sites? Certainly it includes the biophysical sciences, ecology, geology, the atmospheric science, botany, and more. And it definitely includes the sociocultural sciences, such as anthropology, or sociology, or economics, and more. But it also includes interdisciplinary science and scholarship in the humanities, from environmental history to cultural studies to art conservation, the new emerging field of heritage studies itself, paleoarchaeology, and more. And the science that is useful to World Heritage Sites extends to traditional ecological knowledge, tribal science, and the growing movement of citizen science. All these disciplines and more are potentially useful. What purpose is there to science in World Heritage Sites? First, it's good to remember that these sites are extraordinary national and world laboratories for advancing science. Yellowstone, it's the resources of Yellowstone that led to the PCR test, that led to the Human Genome Project. And if any of us in the group took a PCR test during COVID-19, you are indebted to Yellowstone as a World Heritage Site for the contribution to the development of the COVID-19 PCR test. But importantly, science has a responsibility to deliver usable knowledge to World Heritage Sites. Managers, decision makers, and the interested citizenry in every country that care about their World Heritage Sites. Hence, the translation of scientific results to timely, relevant, and accessible information is an integral part of this kind of scientific endeavor. In practical terms, a science project for World Heritage Sites that does not have a budget of at least 10% of its total for translation, dissemination, and sharing the science is, in my view, unhealthy, unwise, and suspect. So how can science and its usable knowledge best be delivered? The American experience has recently shown us the vulnerability and dangers of relying on federal agency science. The Agricultural Research Service in the previous administration received punitive budget cuts, employee reductions, and mandatory moves, all designed to eliminate the ability of that agency to do research. The politicalization of COVID-19 science is a stark reminder of how reliance on the federal science community is imprudent. Hence, partnering with other sources, such as universities or NGOs, may be valuable, prudent, resilient, and even critical. One example of many is the U.S. Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit Network. This network of partnerships was established in 1999. It now includes 17 federal agencies and over 490 other institutions, universities, NGOs, and other partners. The core of the CESU idea is actually straightforward. A host university that's the hub, partner universities and other institutions that are the spokes, and federal agencies that are the wheel. You need the hub, you need the spokes, and you need the wheel if you're going to actually move forward in terms of doing the science. The CESU model can be useful internationally if it's adapted to regional conditions. A key lesson learned is that building the local capacity of regional universities is essential. A harsh way to say it is that outsider universities, relying on outsider universities, is bad strategy. It's bad strategy first on economic grounds. The American universities of Harvard and Yale charge a 69% administrative fee. So if you have $100,000 to contribute to a World Heritage Site research program and you give it to Yale or you give it to Harvard, only $31,000 is going to go to them, to the research, and the rest is a fee, or in other cultures, a skim that goes to the administration of those institutions. It's also a bad strategy because it creates an ill-conceived dependency and a lack of local trust in the science because it's being done by experts who have the halo of expertise from very far away. Building regional capacity for science, perhaps through the CESU model, and creating an at-home new generation of scientists is a necessary investment in the long-term future of World Heritage Sites. And the fate of World Heritage Sites, including St. Sophia Cathedral, the Struve geodesic arc, the virgin beech forests of the Carpathians, the wooden churches of the Carpathian region, all in the Ukraine, and the Chersonese in the occupied Crimea. The fate of those places is our own. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Steve, can you come back on? And Christine? Thank you. Christine, or let me start with Steve. You heard I think you heard my discussion with Mike Reynolds a while ago this afternoon. And I think he's amenable to improving the situation, shall we say, with regard to how OIA is enabled to carry out its duties. I don't think that necessarily means an immediate budget increase, but if the Land and Water Fund program can get 100 FTE, I don't know why OIA can't get 20. And we need to see about that. Christine, and to some extent, John Fowler talked about a lot of options for engaging, constructively engaging the publics, the constituencies of World Heritage Sites through a variety of programs, engagements, internships, and so forth, and including, as we must in the NEPA and 106 processes. Those are ways to really get active public involved in these places. Sometimes it often starts with conflict or disagreement, but often those turn into friendships and partnerships as issues get resolved. And I think it would behoove all of us to find and expand partnerships for these World Heritage Sites, and specifically because they're World Heritage Sites, we have a challenge ahead. I know US ICOMOS has a newly signed cooperative agreement with the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, which can be used by other World Heritage Sites if they've got money to bring to the table, or if we raise the money. That creates the authority for engaging IEP internships. And I guess at this point, I'd like to ask each of you to speak to how you would see opportunities ahead. Certainly, the Biden administration has 2 more years to accomplish things, maybe 6 more years, to get to the place that we need to be with World Heritage Sites in additional support, additional visibility, additional funding, programmatic expansions, and so forth. It'll be different from site to site, perhaps, but I think we need to collectively move in that direction. Any thoughts leap to mind here?
I'll go. I think in terms of gaining resources, at least for the scientific element of World Heritage work, the direct approach hasn't worked through the world, like Stephen has said, because of the limitations. And I believe that one of the things that's missing is we have not brought along the international scientific community to be strong advocates for science and World Heritage Sites. The International Congress of the Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is the largest lobbyist group for science working with the American Congress. To the extent that we don't engage them in World Heritage activities, we're missing an opportunity to have a powerful advocate. Another example would be to work through the science and technology committees that have oversight of the National Science Foundation and develop, like so many other institutions have, dedicated resources from the NSF, which gets a steady increase in budget, many administrations provide, and have a dedicated source related to World Heritage Sites. If we don't try those other routes, then we shouldn't be surprised that we continue to not deliver the resources that these programs need.
I think we haven't tried those routes, so that's a good idea.
Destry, I'll just jump in and say that, I mean, I think the Biden administration, I mean, they've been in for 2 years. They've had a huge amount of stuff to focus on. And the World Heritage Program, and we've seen this before with prior administrations, it doesn't really register in the initial period, but eventually, at least in some administrations, after a couple of years, they kind of wake up and say, oh, this is a cool program. We should be doing more with this. So maybe I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I certainly hope that through events like this, slowly there's going to be greater awareness, among the leadership of what this is and how useful it is and how valuable it could be to engage more with it. So that's one thought that I've had.
Yeah.
I'll add to say that, so I sort of self-brand myself as an entrepreneurial civil servant, and it's those are something I value in the team here at San Antonio Missions. And partly for that reason, I found the session this morning on philanthropy and U.S. World Heritage to be particularly interesting, because I don't think we have a cohort yet. Many, and this isn't about just the National Park Service, this is all U.S. World Heritage sites. Many have foundations attached to, I'll use the 19 of 24 NPS units have some sort of philanthropic group that values the site. But what we haven't really been doing is leveraging that World Heritage from a philanthropic standpoint. We haven't been, I don't think, sharing our communication strategy specifically on World Heritage. And I think we've missed some opportunities to engage with communities, to engage with constituents who are waiting in the wings to support World Heritage in the United States. But we haven't developed a way for groups to do that. I was really inspired to hear that. I think there's already a move out on that the philanthropy session to develop kind of a cohort amongst those foundations attached to U.S. World Heritage. So I would also, I really think we need to look to that community, but I want to echo Gary as well. I think we haven't partnered sufficiently with universities in the United States, specifically on World Heritage. The CESU program is outstanding, fantastic, tons of great work, a great way to engage college and university students. But again, we haven't been doing a lot of projects or programmatic activities specifically focused on U.S. World Heritage, in my opinion.
And Christine, each fall across the country, thousands, not hundreds, thousands of graduate students show up at their university and scratch their head and say, what kind of project can I work on that would be really rewarding to me? And if we don't capture them, because we don't have a wish list, because we don't have contacts with their professors, et cetera, that is an immense talent pool of young people that we don't bring to the table.
Couldn't agree more.
Terrific. We should be on it. We have within US ICOMOS, an emerging young professionals network of people who opt in. And there are at least a couple of National Park Service employees who were previously IEP interns around that we have included in that emerging professionals network. These are typically young people that have at least a master's degree.
Do Stephen and I qualify?
I think we've already emerged, Gary.
Well, yeah. When we establish an emeritus unit, you'll fit right in.
I'm younger than Keith Richards, and so is Stephen.
So that's really a good idea. I'm not sure off the top of my head what we can do immediately, but we should do something. We've been talking about how to reach out to the Friends Alliance through the National Park Foundation already for those World Heritage Site units that are part of the National Park System. And the ones that aren't, like Monticello and Frank Lloyd Wright, they are run by foundations, essentially, by nonprofit philanthropies that have the ability and are effectively doing a good job of raising money for those places. So there is other people's money out there, no question about it. Steve, you and I have wrestled with the question of how do we get the State Department to better recognize and appreciate the what I call soft diplomacy value of promoting the World Heritage Program abroad and putting money into it through whoever, through AID or GEF or the ambassadors funds around the country. I think we have to find a way to do more of that, though that it wouldn't directly benefit the 24 US World Heritage sites. It would enable the Office of International Affairs to broker relationships more expansively, and maybe we use the Friends Alliance organizations or convince them it would be a good idea for them to partner with work that is going on at a World Heritage Site abroad, you know, which is part of the model of the IEP program, with the idea that we have young emerging professionals working in World Heritage Sites in both the US and abroad.
Mhm.
I think we should definitely pursue more of that.
I agree completely, Destry. I think state could be playing a much larger role in this. For whatever reason, World Heritage doesn't seem to be a filter for them, where they see it as the way to channel you know, their assistance efforts. I mentioned the Ambassadors Fund, and I think they do score when they're giving their grants out. If you are applying on behalf of a World Heritage Site in a foreign country, you get extra points for that, but it's really not as much of an emphasis as it should be.
One alternative, Destry, is one of the well-funded science elements of the State Department is the Jefferson Fellowship Program. And if the World Heritage Program could collaborate with the Jefferson Fellowship Program to make sure some of the Jefferson Fellows are interested in doing science related to World Heritage Sites, it would raise the visibility of World Heritage Sites within the State Department, given the kind of interest and enthusiasm that leaders have for the Jefferson Fellowship Program within the State Department.
Are those fellows at the master's, PhD, or postdoc levels? Where do they fall
PhD
academically?
and postdoc, doc, and emerging young scientists.
Okay.
But they're well-funded, they're widely admired within the State Department, and connecting that way could be useful.
You know, Gary, you're mentioning that reminds me that the State Department also runs the Embassy Science Fellowship, which you're probably familiar with, but essentially it's embassies around the world are essentially science projects that they would like US agencies to help them with. And it's kind of a cost share where the embassy pays for the in-country costs or some of the in-country costs, and the agency sponsors one of its staff to go and work in that embassy for a period of time. Unfortunately, the Park Service has only been able to participate on a very limited basis, again, because we really can't afford to have our staff away from their jobs for 6 months at a time doing a science project in Peru. Although actually somebody did go from Joshua Tree National Park to help Peru set up their permitting system for, you know, scientific research in their national park. So that's a great idea, and I wish we could do more of it, but we often have to take a pass, even though it would benefit our people so much as well to be able to do these fellowships. But, you know, you talked about increasing staff in the International Affairs Office. We need to increase staff in the parks too. They can't afford to leave their duty station for any length of time.
Total FTE, the Park Service was cut by several thousand in the previous administration. So that has to be built back. And I see that in the FY23 appropriations, quite a few additional FTE are funded. So it's, you know, it takes a while to build that capacity back.
Yeah.
You know, I know when the previous administration was very negative about climate change, a number of mid-career scientists left the agency as a consequence of a adverse position. We've got to get not necessarily those individuals, but that capacity back in the agency, without question. But Gary, within the CESU network in the US, do we have any way of knowing or finding out which of those US universities have international university connections, so that you could foster a program where professors and postdocs in those other countries could partner with a USA hub or spoke university. I know money's always the question, but is there a connection already that exists? Is there a mechanism to create a connection, university to university?
There are very few international connections within the CESU network. However, it's allowable, and there are a couple of them, primarily with Canada, British Columbia, for example. So that could be expanded that as a first step. But another alternative is to establish CESUs in other countries that need this work with their local university as the host, not the American university.
Right.
And the American universities become partners. A CESU network is not a pile of money. It is a handshake that allows money to move from one institution to another. So you first establish the handshake, and then you can find the money to flow. But I believe the long-term future is to establish the hosts in other countries with US universities as partners, rather than make other country universities partners to American established CESUs.
Okay. Unless there's a last burning question, I think it's 5 p.m. It's Miller time somewhere. And I'm going to ask Doug to come back on and close us for the day. And thank you, Christine, Steve, and Gary very much.
What can I say? That was amazing. This has been a conference symposium worthy of a 50th anniversary. That's absolutely certain. I can't think of one that might have addressed the challenges, and now we're talking about opportunities that lay ahead for both our United States National ICOMOS Committee, as well as for ICOMOS and the World Heritage Convention. As I mentioned on the first day, we are going to have to reach out to partners and collaborators, those organizations and institutions, we've just heard about some of them, that share or have interests complementary with our uniquely global organization. And I think we have some leads now. With so many people I would like to thank, I hesitate to begin. I thank all the eloquent speakers for the remarkably informative and very relevant presentations. Nevertheless, it's clear that what has transpired over the past 2 days would not have been possible without Destry Jarvis. He carried by far most of the weight in organizing and moderating the United States National Committee Conference and Symposium. And he worked very closely with the inaugural National Park Service Site Managers Forum. And I also in that regard, send my special thanks to Christine Jacobs. Finally, my deep thanks to Ariana Zarzuski and Caitlin Cunningham, who you haven't seen much of. They've been working behind the scenes to address all the technical issues that arose by presenting this conference and symposium. All right, now, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, I'm going to unveil now the new logo and name for the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. Let me share my screen. Okay, so 2022, it is indeed a time to take stock, as we've been doing for the past couple of days on the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention, which is actually, yeah, this is the 16th of November. Now the goal of this simply, well, not just simply, but one of our primary goals is to reach more people who care about our shared global heritage. You see what has been for a very long time our logo, our beloved logo. I'm going to miss Pegasus. I'm going to miss him very much, but Our new trade name will be World Heritage USA. Subtext, second line being the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And so with that, I unveil this, our new logo, World Heritage USA, U.S. National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And remember, that is who we are, the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. Simply that when you use the term U.S. ICOMOS, really almost no one except members of U.S. ICOMOS understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to say, and who we are, what we're trying to be, and what we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to be using this name now, World Heritage USA. That's our logo. This is it. It's a new name for a new day. I think we've talked about a lot of ideas and new directions over the past couple of days. We're going to be announcing more new projects, programs, and activities now that we have this new name. We're setting down the same road, but with some additional objectives. We will be pursuing the partnerships that we talked about today and some others, and we've heard some suggestions that we will follow up with. And you're going to hear a lot more about this in the near future and for months thereafter and probably years thereafter. This is a new start. So until you hear from us again, which will be very soon, stay well. And let's work together for a better world. With that, thank you so much. We'll see you soon.